Welcome to the Profile Corner. Today's video is part 5 in the Mortise and Tenon series. In the last video, we used a router, specifically a plunge router, to cut some holes for mortises, as you can see here. And we used some homemade jigs to cut those holes using the big plunge router that's back here. And then we used another jig to create two mortises that are angled. And then we created boards with tenons on them using a homemade tenoning jig. In today's video, we'll be looking at using commercial jigs to produce the mortises and also the tenons. And in addition to making this the last time, we also took an attempt at making a nap joint or canap joint, and we were able to get 75% of the joint to work, but we still need to work on trying to come up with a larger bearing follower so that we can get the radius here to look right in the template. And when that failed to come together, we then created a through mortise and tenon on the PantoRouter. And that worked out really well for us, and we've got it slightly protruding from the end, just as was desired. And then we could put a nice little bevel on the little piece that's sticking out and use that kind of as an accent. Okay, so in today's video, let's get started. We're going to head over to the other workbench that has a bench vise on it, and that's where we'll set up our boards that I've got here. This board will receive a mortise on this end and also on this end, and then our tenon will be cut into this board over at the table saw. I have the board mounted into the vise, and I have the router here set up with a 1/2 inch wide bit, and it has a ultimate router base mounted onto the bottom of it. This is a special base that costs right around $150. At least that's what it costs when I bought it earlier this year. And this automatically centers onto the router, and then some adapters can be installed into the bottom of the router base that allows it to automatically center onto a board. And so this makes it really simple to create a mortise in the center of the board. Now the issue that we have here is that these are very close to the maximum limit that we can get on the board back here. In other words, I've got to be very careful as I approach the end of this board, because these pins will end up falling off the edge of the board and over to the side. And so I have to watch for that and be very careful. So I'm ready to get started. I don't have to do any setup on the router other than I set the depth of cut to about 1 5/8 inches. And then I don't have to do any centering because it's all done for me automatically with this ultimate router base. Okay, so we're centered now. And so now I gotta be really careful when I approach the end down here. So I don't have to do quite as much cleanup as this later pass. And I'll go down to the other end so I know where the stopping point's at. Okay, so we've got that cut, and we've got a little bit of a problem here in that the board here was a little bit weak, and it ended up blowing out this little chunk here. Well, hopefully that won't happen to you. That's always a risk when you're routing in toward the end of a board. Okay, so now we've got to cut this other mortise here. I've got a different router set up for that. This is not fully set up yet. This has 2 router edge guides on it that not all edge guides will work like this, but there's a Bosch edge guide right here, and I've pushed it back as far as it'll go on the rails in this direction, and then I've installed a partial Bosch edge guide, removing the micro adjustment from the end here onto the other end, and that'll give me support on both sides of the board, just as I have when I was using this router, and also when I was using the Bosch 1611 EVS router in the last video. I have not set the correct position yet for the fence here, so I'll have to do that next. Okay, I have the fence on this side, on the back side, in the right position, so I'll lock down the position of that fence using the thumb screws on the router here, and then I'll bring the other fence over to it, and then I'll bring the other fence over to the board, and now I have it secured on both sides. Okay, the last thing to do is to set the depth of cut. I have a 1 inch and a 1/2 inch setup block, so I'll use those. Okay, and I'll set it to about 1 5/8. Okay, so now we're ready to make our cut. Okay, the 2 tenons have been cut now, and now I'll just square up the ends of these using the 1/2 inch chisel. On the table saw here, I have a Delta tenoning jig. Delta no longer makes these jigs because, of course, Delta is not the same company that it was when these jigs were being made. There's other companies that make these jigs. There's at least 2 different styles of the Delta jig. This one seems to be pretty good. The other one may be even better. What I've done here is I've used setup blocks to set the blade height to 1.5 inches above the base that's down here, just by setting a 1 inch setup block, and then on top of that a 1/2 inch setup block, I have mounted into the saw a rip style blade that has 40 teeth. The rip style blade, of course, has straight teeth going across instead of beveled teeth as you would see in a cross-cut or combination blade. So the height has been set to 1.5 inches. Now I need to set the position of the fence, and the board is supposed to sit on a little ledge down here. So I'll mount it in using the clamp, trying to make sure that it's square in the back side here also. And now I need 1 inch between this portion here and the inside tooth, and I'm off a little bit, so I need to loosen up the clamp, and then I'll use the micro adjuster to move it over, and it looks like I only need to move it a little bit to get it at 1 inch. So it's now at 1 inch, so I can lock it down, and now I should be ready to make the cut. Now, unlike the custom-made tenoning jig where I could do this face and also the edge face, here I can only do this face here and also the inside one, and then we'll have to come up with another method to cut those other edges. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so now I'm done with the tenoning jig, and I can lower the blade down so that it's only a 1/2 inch above the table, so that I can then use the miter gauge and make these cuts right back in here. Okay, that looks good. I'll bring in the miter gauge. And now I can bring over the rip fence, set it at 1.5 inches from this side of the blade. And check it back here too. That may be just a hair over. Okay, so now to limit the chances of kickback, you need to move the fence back. Okay, make sure that it clears the end of the fence before it starts the cut, and it does. The miter gauge is right 90 degrees. Always use push stick or some other piece of wood, remove any kind of pieces that may kick back on you. Okay, along here, I'll do these cuts as well. Make sure that we got the dimensions right. It may be just a little bit over a ½ inch thick. And this dimension is right on. So here's what we have so far. Okay, so let's head over to the bandsaw, and then we'll take care of taking off this little piece here and this little piece right here. Okay, now I'll bring the fence on the bandsaw over so that the blade will be 2½ inches from the fence. And of course the blade will be on this side of 2½ inches. And it looks pretty close. Let's lock this down and then we'll test it again, or check it again. And I think that that's going to cut it ever so slightly under. Okay, so we've got it set now. Let's go ahead and we'll make the cuts. And I'll watch for this piece to fall off when I make the cut. Okay, so that was a real quick cut. Let's verify that it's 2 inches across. And it is exactly 2 inches across. So we're set there. Unfortunately, this tenon is just ever so slightly too thick. By maybe a 1/64 of an inch. So we'll have to shave this down just a little bit using a chisel before we assemble the joint. I have the 1 inch chisel here, and I'll be using that to just kind of shave this down ever so slightly. And I don't need to do too much. I should probably also just slightly round this section here. Okay, and we'll do the same on the other side. Okay, so that's probably going to be good enough. So let's see if the joint goes together now. It's still ever so slightly too tight, but the joint did go together, as you can see there, and we're mostly flush on the end here. I took the tenon back out of the mortise and I did a quick measurement using the digital caliper, and I found that the tenon is a bit strong by about a 32nd of an inch. This says that it's 0.5 5285 rather than 0.50. So I've mounted the board with the tenon back onto the tenoning jig, and I'm going to try to take care of that problem. It's a 64th strong on each side of the tenon, and so I'm going to attempt to use the micro adjust feature to take that down. To a 1/2 inch. Okay, I think I've got it somewhat close. So let's try to take that off and see where we end up. The tenon is now at 0.511, so we're still about 11 thousandths oversized. So let's adjust it again. Lock it down and test it. Okay, we're now at 0.497. That's 0.495. So we're about 3 to 5 thousandths under a 1/2 inch. And that should go together much better than the way it did originally. And unfortunately, we couldn't really test this out that effectively until we got rid of these portions of the board to reveal the true size of the tenon. So in the future we may change the order of the operations to use the miter gauge first to make these cuts and also this cut here, so that way when we put the board into the tenoning jig, then it ends up cutting off the portion here, and that way we'd be able to test the width of the tenon immediately to make sure that it's the size that we're expecting to see. Okay, so I'll go put this together and then I'll bring it over to the camera so that you can see that it now goes together perfectly. And here you can see that the joint goes together without splitting out the end grain here, as happened earlier. And it's a very tight fit. And this is smooth across here. There's no offset or anything like that. Okay, so let's head over to the PantoRouter and we'll cut a joint there. I have the diamond template mounted into the PantoRouter centered, and then I've got a board here that measures 1.25 inches square, and I've got two boards here. They're both 3/4 inch thick and 3 inches wide. What I'd like to do is create a mortise and tenon joint where the tenon goes all the way through in that direction, and then I've got another mortise and tenon joint going all the way through in this direction. And I'd like to see if I can do that using this template. I have a 12mm bearing fowler mounted into the PantoRouter and a 3/8 inch router bit. So the spiral cutting bit that comes with the PantoRouter. And I thought that I'd give this a shot. I have the template holder set so that it'll be centered in this 1¼ inch thick board. And so I'll just mount it into the table here, and then we'll get started trying to make the cuts. I've got to put the front stops in so that I can make sure that the board gets aligned with the front of the table. Okay, and the fence here is set exactly 1.5 inches from the center line of the table so that it'll be exactly 1/2 of the width of these boards. Okay, so that's been set, so I can move this front stop out of the way. I'll put this 12mm bearing fowler all the way to the back of the template. And I'm going to hook up the dust collection to the unit and spin the PantoRouter around so that you have a better view of what's happening. Okay, I'll set the depth of cut to 1¼ inch, or just over 1¼ inch. As a matter of fact, I'll set it to 1 3/8 inches, just using the ruler that's built into the PantoRouter. Okay, so that's been set. Now I'll add in the dust brush. Okay, that's been set. Now we should be able to see the bit coming through the other side. Okay, our first cut has been made now for the mortise. Here it is here. Let's just check the width of it at the widest portion. And we're getting just over 5/8 of an inch. Almost 11/16. Okay, so now that we've got this cut, let's cut the mating tenon on the end of the first board. Okay, so I need to have this sticking out at least 1¼ inch from the end. Okay, let's set our template holder height to 3/4 of an inch. We'll just use this other 3/4 inch thick board to do that. Okay, so now I've got a tapered fowler in here, and I just want to see where that's going to hit. And that'll tell me roughly how large of a bearing fowler we'll have to go to. So I've got it at the highest point right there. And if I move the bit in, it's touching it. The tapered fowler here is as far back as I can go with it without it rubbing onto the template holder. And I'll start with that position. And then we'll have to take a closer look. I'll probably have to remove this board off the table and see how well it's fitting into the mortise. And we may need to touch up the mortise slightly, but we don't know that yet until we have a chance to look at this a little more fully. Okay, so let's see if it looks like it'll work. Okay, so here's what it looks like on the inside, and you may be able to see that the tenon is the right height, but it still won't fit in, and it looks like the tenon is maybe a 1/16 of an inch too wide to go into there. And so we'll have to probably try to make this mortise a little bit wider. But while we're here, let's go ahead and we'll cut that tenon the rest of the way, since it does look like it's the right height. And then we'll actually cut the tenon in the other board as well. Okay, so I'll put this back up here so that it's sticking out at least 1.25 inches. Okay, set the depth of cut again. That's going to be a little bit challenging. Okay, so we'll slightly overshoot the depth of cut. Which just means we'll have a little bit to trim off. Okay, so we have one tenon cut, as you can see right there. Let's cut the other one. Set the depth of cut to 1.25 inches. Okay. Now we're ready to cut. Okay, so now the second tenon's been cut. And let's just check it and see. That one looks the same as the first one. And it's also too wide. So that means that we got to try to make this mortise a little bit wider. So I'll put the board back up here to set the height. Of the template holder. Okay, so that'll center it in the board. So what I'll try to do is swap out to a smaller bearing follower, which will allow us to get further up into the corner. Okay, so I'll go to 10 millimeter. And we'll just plunge this in at the end, each end. Okay, let's see. Okay, so let's take it out of the clamps here and see if we did any good here. We may have gone too far with it. And it did work, but it looks awfully sloppy there. And so what we could do is we could make that into a wedge tenon just by splitting it down the middle here. And then create a wedge that fits in. And I've taken the tenons over to the bandsaw and I cut a slot here that's roughly 1/8 inch wide and 3/4 inch long, and now I'll create a wedge that'll fit into there, and hopefully that'll allow the joint to close up. And I've remeasured the slot here, and it's actually just over 1/16 of an inch wide. And so what I did was I created an angled board here using the bandsaw, and it measures roughly 1/16 of an inch at the bottom and just over 1/8 inch at the top. And what I'm thinking is that I can put this down inside just like so, and then hammer that in place, and that should spread out the joint, and then it should look decent, I think. And it does work. It's not super tight, so we'd have to use a little bit of probably glue and sawdust once we glue this together to make that joint real tight, but it's pretty good. I think I'll do the same thing for the cherry board. I'll cut a black walnut wedge and we'll put this thing together. Okay, here's the cherry tenon with a black walnut wedge that was just cut at the bandsaw, and it should slide down in there nicely. And then when this goes through the board, through the mortise, that should close up fairly well, I believe. So I'm going to try to hammer that in and see how it looks. Okay, here's the result. The cherry tenon is sticking out ever so slightly beyond the end of the mortise, but that's a very tight fit now, which is what we want. We may have to use a little bit of sawdust and glue to fix a little bit of imprecision around the end here, but it looks very good. So I'm going to glue that together, and then we'll finish up by sending the black walnut board through this direction here. And here's the joint after the glue dried. I sanded it down lightly, so it turned out really nice. And now what we need to do is we need to have the other board come through here, and so we'll have to create another mortise using the same approach. This particular template that I have mounted into the PantoRouter, I believe it's actually designed for using a 1/2 inch wide cutter bit, and that's why we're having a little bit of difficulty here. But the wedge tenon looks really nice, and so I think that we'll be able to use this approach without too much difficulty. I have the 12mm fowler mounted into the PantoRouter, and I'm ready to cut the other mortise. Okay, so let's see if our tenon will fit down inside. And it's going to be too tight on the ends again. So I'll switch over to the 10mm fowler, and I'll just clip the ends like we did the last time. Okay, so it now fits through, and we'll just have to glue it in place. Let's take it out of the clamps here so I can show you what it looks like. So I'll glue this joint, and then we can take a look at it again later on. Here's the result with a little bit of oil rubbed onto the board to highlight the difference in the colors of the wood. It turned out rather well after being glued up and sanded, and of course a little bit of glue and sawdust was used in the ends to fill in the small gap that was remaining. overall, I think that this was successful. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.